Thank you so much. And it's really great to be here. I'm really excited about sharing the insights from the Connected College and facilitating a discussion about how you engage communities, how you redesign services, and how you shape culture to make that happen. Um, to introduce myself, I'll say that I have had the good fortune of working with more than 100 colleges and universities. And in that work, I've seen how maybe an unclear strategy or a siloed structure or how tradition might get in the way of innovation when people are working really hard to help students succeed. And so, based on that experience, based on my research, based on conversations with dozens of higher ed innovators, I wrote the Connected College to provide a encouraging evidence-based playbook so that folks in higher ed can work better together internally, can partner externally to help students succeed. And I'm really excited about sharing some of those insights with all of you today. And I thought to give you an example of what success looks like, what does a connected college or university look like? I thought we could go through experiential learning because we know it's something that's so impactful, right? At building skills and knowledge and relationships. It's personal, um, and it's personal for students, it's personal for faculty, it's personal for all of you. And not only is it personal, but it's important. We know that more than 80% of students want to work on class projects with companies, but only about 30% of faculty offer these. So part of the reason they may not offer these, it might be happening as a kind of a one-off, right? A faculty member in the business school knows a company nearby, they end up doing a marketing campaign for them, and that's great, but that's something you do, it's not something you are. And so if you really want to scale up and integrate and embed experiential learning, it requires connectivity across a variety of groups, right? It requires faculty getting excited about working with companies and community groups on new kinds of assignments, new kinds of scenarios. It requires support from the library and IT, space, technology. It might be space to work on that project. It might be a makerspace, a media lab. It might be a place to practice a presentation. It might be a place to print a 3D prototype. It also requires collaboration with the Career Center, right? Thinking about how those skills, how those projects, how they build into a portfolio, how that might help you explore a future career path. It requires help from the Center for Teaching and Learning to really help faculty make that transition to working on active learning, experiential learning, project-based learning. And it requires folks from corporate and alumni relations to build those relationships so that you have companies and community groups to work with, whether it's a regular class project or a capstone or something. And so when you actually create those kinds of collaborations, you connect in 5 ways that are really critical that I talk about in the book. Um, so one kind of connection is feeling a sense of belonging, being part of a community. A second connection is connecting students to support, whether it is presentation, tutoring, writing, subject-based, skill-based, relationship-based. It's also connecting the coursework and the co-curriculars to career paths. It's collaborating internally, it's partnering externally. And those are sort of the 5 big connections that I talk about in the book, cutting across a variety of chapters, right? So if you imagine the org chart of a college or university, each box kind of has a chapter, right? Assessment, academic programs, academic support, athletics, advancement, some things that don't start with A, like libraries and career and IT and facilities and board governance. Each one with an inspirational profile of an innovator, 3 big ideas and lots of cross-cutting tactics about collaborating across these different functions. And when you're collaborating across these different functions, that's how you can move from conventional thinking to better connected colleges and universities, right? So instead of adapting to change by adding, you might look for ways to collaborate or even consolidate when you have duplicative efforts. Instead of getting spread thin, trying to constantly do more with less, you're actually focusing so you can do less with more. Instead of kind of following your peers, you're figuring out what makes you different and how to differentiate your program, your group, your institution. And that's how you move from, I think, some of the conventional thinking that might be holding us back to better connected colleges and universities. And so today we're going to talk about 3 different themes to create these kind of connections: engaging communities, redesigning services, and shaping culture. And for each, I'll share some stats, I'll share some stories, I'll share some strategies, and we'll pause for discussion. So if you have a burning question or a great comment, you don't have to wait 45 minutes to make it. And I hope this will be a great chance for us to interact and discuss. And you'll know when it's time to ask questions because I will let you know, and I will ask you questions. So as we think about engaging communities, it's interesting. We do a national student survey, student experience snapshot, and one of the dimensions of that survey is about campus climate and culture. Every year, the lowest score from students is having a say in my institution. Without a doubt, it's the lowest one. The other thing we know is that when we talk to students, we find out they're often unaware of all the amazing things that a college or university offers. In fact, you might have a focus group and they're asking for something you already do. They just don't know about it. And then when you talk to them, you do find out and you uncover these needs, like what a priority experiential learning is. And so I want to share a story about engaging communities for the transformation of the presence in Midtown Manhattan for the New York Public Library. And this was a project I got involved in after perhaps a storied history. They had been working for about 10 years on what was a sort of a failed consolidation plan. The idea was they had 3 locations in Midtown Manhattan: the Schwartzman Building on Bryant Park, the Mid-Manhattan Library across the street, which was far and away the biggest branch library, serving, I think, 2 million people a year. And then the Science, Industry, and Business Library, Sybil, about 5 blocks away. And so by engaging the community and rebuilding trust that maybe had been lost in the way that plan had previously been developed, we were able to pivot and actually keep 2 of the locations open and realize it did make sense to close the Sybil Library, because I think upwards of 40% of the people that went to Sybil actually went to the other 2 locations in their same visit. So people were going often to the wrong place because the collection, the staff, the services were kind of like artificially divided. So bringing them together was actually better for people, though a difficult decision. And the way we made that decision was from a really robust community engagement process, where we went broad and we went deep. So we went broad with a survey that I think 70,000 folks answered, and they were users and non-users. We went broad with town hall meetings, where a lot of those meetings was about getting sort of verbal tomatoes thrown at me, but dodging them, I think, relatively deftly, and in the process making sure people felt heard, and we rebuilt and regained some trust that actually we were listening. In addition to broad and deep, it was also quantitative and qualitative, right? Asking people about what they were interested in, trying to quantify what can be squishy concepts. So one of the things we asked people about, how should the library feel? To what degree should it feel like a bookstore, like a museum, like home, like a learning center, a school? And that was kind of an interesting thing, quantifying the qualitative. We did ethnographic observations, shadowing folks, interviewing folks, carefully selected, though it was an N of 20, a very carefully selected N to be representative of users and non-users and understanding their experiences in the library and around the city. And then with that broad, deep, quant engagement, then you have to really make it tangible so people get a sense of what you've heard, that you've heard them, and you start making sense of it. So thinking about putting things in priority order, writing things down, talking about what a day in the life looks like, trying to turn abstract things into concrete things. Like, so for instance, an experience can be rather abstract, but one way to make it concrete is to talk about what are the key moments in that experience. You know, when are you navigating? When are you discovering? When are you immersing yourself? When are you creating? And then what sorts of spaces might help you do those things? Is it a tech hub? Is it a learning hub? Is it a research and writing hub? And then communicating those concepts for ideas even sort of before they exist, before they've come to fruition, so that you can get better feedback on them with sketches like this that are less about a space, but more about an experience that you want the public, that you want your users, that you want people to have, and you want staff and others to support. Let's move on to redesigning services. Once you've engaged communities, you can start to understand a little bit more about the services that support them. And one thing we know is that services drive usage, which is pretty interesting. We did a study a couple years ago. We looked at 3 years of data from 38 libraries. Libraries that have student success functions in them, like a Center for Teaching and Learning, like tutoring, like writing, like advising, career, presentation practice, prototyping, media lab, maybe. They're used 25% more at peak. We also know that as we keep offering more, the platforms we use to offer programs, support, tend to proliferate. So it's not uncommon for people to have to use 2, 3, 4 different pieces of software to do their job. Advisors, counselors. I think it's 74% of counselors have to use 3 different platforms just to kind of engage with the student, to log the interaction and so forth. So the platforms are proliferating, and then there are some gaps between satisfaction with space and services. Students tend to be more satisfied with library spaces than they are with library services, and both of these numbers are pretty high. So 70s and 80s are pretty good. But maybe there's an opportunity there to close that gap. And I think over the last 10, 15 years, libraries have done an amazing job at space innovation, right? Thinking about, once you lose the monopoly on information and your value proposition is not just collections, but it's also people and expertise and services and technology and space, the space innovation has been amazing, providing a variety of inspiring, enriching spaces. And now I think it's time for the services and the program and the operations of those spaces, could be a faculty development workshop as well, to catch up. And so if you want to do that service innovation, it takes a really deliberate process. And I want to walk you through the process we used at University of Miami. And the context here was maybe similar to the context here at Yale. Lots of amazing services, but a pretty diffused or distributed approach to it, right? Where advising is over here, tutoring is over here, writing is over here, research is over here, technology help desk is over here. And so the thought was, everybody's doing pretty darn good on their own, but we could go from like good to great if we were together. And how do we overcome spatial, organizational, cultural separations to help students succeed? So that starts with understanding connections, mapping out, looking at it qualitatively, quantitatively, who's referring to who, where are the connections between these different services and functions, and then actually mapping it out. And if this looks like a mess, it's because it was. Um, you know, what a web of different services and referrals, and how do you cut the Gordian knot, as it were, among these different services to create shorter um, referral paths? How do you do programming together in collaboration? And the way that we did that was to back up and think about the competencies. So what do we want students to be able to do when they graduate? We want them to be able to work with data. We want them to be able to work together. We want them to be able to conduct research. We want them to be able to publish and promote that work. And so this kind of became the North Star for the project, because this was how we created the common ground, the shared vision. Here's what we're working together on. It's about creating these competencies, and we all have different roles to play in making it happen. And to make it happen, we had to think about how to sort of design, how to identify different partners, and how to design those partnerships. How were people going to work together? To what degree they might be moving in together to co-locate, to what degree they might be, creating a satellite presence in order to be together and work together, to what degree they might be visiting for office hours, programming, workshops. And so this helped us kind of define different ways to partner, different sort of tiers or different methods of partnership. And then once you're working together, you have to think about how roles change, right? What individual roles are staying the same? What new roles need to be created? And in order to do that, you might have to sunset. In order to do these new things, you might have to sunset some of the old things that you were doing in order to do other things in the future. And then some roles might change. They might combine. And once you've thought about the services, worked backwards from the competencies, designed the partnerships, rethought the roles, then you can think about how you create a real community of practice, right? Because having neighbors is great, right? But you probably don't have a neighborhood until you start doing things together, right? If you think about your block or your apartment or your neighborhood. And so creating a community of practice means different groups understanding what they each do, building relationships across, creating a regular cadence when you meet, what you meet about, how you operate the space, how you do collaborative programming. And those things together are actually how you get results. And the Learning Commons now, about 7 years later, from a transaction basis, they're doing about twice as much. So they're serving about twice as many students when you look at the number of consultations and workshops. And along with this change, retention has actually also gone up 4 points. Of course, that's a multivariate kind of thing. Act 3 is about shaping culture, right? You've engaged communities, you've redesigned services. Now you need to think about your organization to deliver on those services. And it's interesting, about 40% of faculty and staff in higher ed aren't satisfied with their current org structure. Across sectors, about 80% of folks have experienced a reorg and only 50% have been successful. But we know that when people manage the change intentionally, correctly, proactively, you're 7 times more likely to succeed. So it's not all doom and gloom if you have the right process. And so I want to talk about a culture change project that in a way was organizational, operational, and space change in one at University of Michigan to create a center of centers. And at the time, the context was that Michigan was going through what they called the administrative services transformation, or a shared services transformation. So looking at things like HR, IT, finance, what could be centralized, what was the right mix of central versus distributed, and also looking at all the different centers and institutes they had each of which might have their own budget person, each of which might have their own comms person, each of which might have their own events person, each of which might have their own tech person, each of which might have their own space person. And so the thought was, how do we co-locate different centers and institutes? And it could be the Center for Complex Systems, it could be the Center for China Studies, it could be the Center for Engaged Learning, right? Talking about community engagement and experiential learning. That might have different needs. How could they come together to share ideas, share space, share services as part of this broader administrative services transformation, and do it in a way so it's not about what you're losing. It's not an overwhelming sense of loss of identity, of control, but actually what's to be gained by coming together through collaboration, through co-location. And culture is kind of an abstract, squishy thing. So a lot of what you have to do, kind of like experience, right? We were talking about earlier, one of the ways you make an experience concrete is you talk about the key moments in it, right? Navigating, immersing, and so forth. One of the ways that you make culture explicit is by thinking about certainly values, but also kind of activities and routines and rituals. And so, and there's lots of great ways to do this. We started with, there's something called the competing values framework you may have heard of. It's actually two University of Michigan professors, Cameron and Quinn. And you plot your organization based on how fixed or flexible you are and how internal or externally focused you are. We did kind of a version of that because folks were really interested in the Bowling Alone, Robert Putnam, bridging capital, which is across groups, and bonding capital, which is within groups in terms of different kinds of social capital. So we talked about different activities, tried to make it concrete, and then asked folks to kind of plot where they were. So then we understood the different parts, and we had to think through how to come together. And scenario planning was a great tool for that, because scenario planning is a structured way to think about different futures, right? F. Scott Fitzgerald said the sign of intelligence, I may be butchering the quote here, but I'll give you the essence. The sign of intelligence is being able to hold two contradictory things in your mind and still function. Scenario planning is a way for us, those of us mere mortals, to be able to do that, to marinate in that ambiguity while you think about the future. And what you do is you think about your two big decisions. Each one becomes an axis. And the way they cross, you get four different futures. So we had to think about how are we going to bring these different cultures together. And the two axes were identity and programming. And so were we going to kind of blend everyone together in a melting pot? Or was it about kind of celebrating the uniqueness, the idiosyncrasies, the diversity of different groups in more of a mosaic? And was that programming more about concentrative, creative, research-based endeavors? Or was it more outward-facing about communications and events and programming? And so what we ended up doing through the scenario planning is actually coming up with a kind of a hybrid approach, because when we looked across a couple dozen or maybe 3 dozen different centers and institutes, there were some that were fairly introverted, and what they needed is like coffee and whiteboards and quiet space. We put them toward the top of the building, and we sort of created a little bit of a melting pot among them, right? Because they had similar needs and they were working together. And then there were other units that were more outward-facing communication, the Center for Engaged Learning, right? Running lots of workshops. We put them toward the bottom. And then there were these shared services and support units, HR, IT, finance, in the middle to kind of support up and down with collaboration and event spaces above and below. So it was kind of a hybrid of within your type of unit, a melting pot, but then a mosaic across the two. And that looks really good on paper, but how are you going to make it real? Who's going to like champion this change and bring people along? piloting is a great way to do that, to identify and support your change champion. So we worked with a group that was really gung-ho about a new way of working and a new space to work in. We piloted it in a space and worked out the kinks, and then they became the advocates. So other groups could be like, oh, how did it work working this way? And they could tell people about their experience. They could lead the change. And then you want to measure the change, right? Back to the question earlier, you want to measure against your goals, and that gives you a sense of how you did, and also a sense of where you can improve. Like when we did this measurement, we realized there was a lot of, there was definitely some like processes and policies that could be tweaked. And things like distractions went up a little bit, but so did collaboration and awareness of other units and cohesion within units. And so it netted out positive. And the most positive net, I talked about one of the goals was to not have this feel like less, but actually to get more. People got more time back. So a new way of working and a new space to do it in saved the average occupant 4.26 hours per week. So it was like gaining 10% of your week back, or all of a sudden it's like you have 10% more people on your team. I want to leave you with one final thought, and I know some of you will have to leave, but others can stay, and then we'll have a kind of a hands-on activity with one of the tools in the book. But so before I wrap up for our 1 hour participants, I want to leave you with a final word of advice from an unlikely source, because I know as you try and implement these things, right, as you try and engage communities, redesign services, shape culture, you're going to run into barriers, you're going to run into resistance. And 80 years ago, the Organization of Strategic Services, the OSS, or the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, wrote a now declassified book, which is called the Simple Sabotage Field Manual. And it's like a playbook for disrupting the progress of any organization. It's like, make your groups big, never less than 5. Argue about minutia and wording. Reopen past decisions that have already been made. And so I think some of these things sound familiar because we see them in our own organizations, no matter how much progress you make or how productive they are. And so I think it's really about flipping the script, right? It's about focusing on the big picture. It's about finding ways to move forward. It's about working in small, agile teams and checking in as and when you need to. And I think when you do that, you can question and break from conventional wisdom to create better connected colleges and universities, right? Where it's not about more with less, it's focused so you can do less with more. Where it's not about copying your peers, it's about differentiating what you do and building on your strengths. Where it's not about adapting by adding, it's about collaboration and consolidation and coordination so that students can succeed. And I want to thank you for your time and comments today. Really appreciate it. Yeah.